I assume that the audience is actually pretty convinced there's no crisis of confidence and they go back to business as usual. So I'm very happy to introduce this discussion of to me, a fascinating topic. Before I start it, let me just, what's actually been pointed out, all of the participants in this panel are noted authors who have written very provocative books, columns, and so forth. And the attraction to me is, while I have some idea what each of them is going to say, I'm not at all sure. I thought there should be some excitement. But I have read and reviewed, I think, books by all of them, so I have sort of some idea. Just to give the background, just two points. I suppose in between 1989 and 1991, most of us thought that a title like this would have been completely inconceivable, even just as a subject for discussion, because capitalism had unambiguously and comprehensively won. The Soviet system had completely disintegrated peacefully, quite extraordinary. It wasn't quite clear where China was going to go at that point. It was, after all, a Zitelmann incident, as they euphemistically call it, had occurred in '89. But it was pretty clear that China was moving in the reform direction. And not long after this, was also pretty major reforms in India. And so this was a huge chunk of the world in transformation. Nowadays, you get, of course, crisis of confidence type articles of different kinds. This reflects perhaps two different classes of things. A sense that the economic performance of the capitalist economies, particularly in the West, has not been very good. Productivity growth is very low. Inequality has risen substantially, and very large parts of the population have experienced very long periods of different length of real income stagnation. And of course, there was this gigantic financial crisis between 2007 and 2009, which led to a simply massive government rescue program, which was sort of not what was supposed to happen with capitalism, was it? And then there's a growing sense, even I find, listening at a conference just another seminar I moderated today, that there's an awful lot of what I refer to as rentier capitalism. That is to say, rent extraction in many, many different forms in the current capitalist system, monopolies, intellectual property used in predatory ways, inadequately competitive structures, and the emergence, of course, of huge and immensely powerful natural monopolies in the platform economy. So there are issues here at the very least. And to guide us through them we have this wonderful panel. So I'm going to start with Rainer Zitelmann, and I'm going to ask him to tell us why there is in fact nothing whatsoever wrong with contemporary capitalism.
Yes, 200 years ago, 90% of the global population was living in extreme poverty, and today this percentage has fallen to only 10%. And I think what's more important, half of this reduction has happened over the last 35 years. And when the left-wing economist Thomas Piketty speaks about the last 35 years, all he sees is an increasing inequality and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. And if I look back over the same 35 years, I see a dramatic decline in poverty like it never happened before in history. And if you take the history of the 20th century, you can see it like a test tube. So, you know, every system is a mixture between state and market. And then you can see what happens if you add, like as they did in China over the last 40 years, more market, or if you, as they did in Venezuela, add more state, what they did over the last 2 decades. And I give you the example of China. In the end of the 50s, 45 million people died in China as a result of the biggest socialist experiment in history, Mao's so-called Great Leap Forward. And even 1981, 88% of the Chinese people were living in extreme poverty. Today, this percentage has fallen to only less than 1%. And perhaps you're a little bit surprised that I take China as an example for the power of capitalism. Is China a purely capitalist state? Of course, it is not. But as I mentioned before, every system is a mixture between state and market, and the absolute ratio is not so important. If you want to understand the development, it's more important how this mixture is going to change. And if you want to understand what happened in China, all this economic progress was only because they implemented more principles of free market and private property. When I've been in China, I spoke with a Chinese economist, Zhang Wang, and he repeated again and again, our economic success was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. And this is a misunderstanding here in the West, and the figures prove him right. Today, the private sector contributes 60% to the GDP in China and is responsible for 70% of the innovation, 80% of the rural employment, and 90% of new jobs created. So you see, if I speak about capitalism, I have a global view. And a lot of people who criticize capitalism, they look only what happens in the United States and what happens in Europe. They have a very narrow Eurocentric and American-centric perspective. But if you take a more global perspective like I have it, then you see it's more than 1 billion people who came out of poverty in the last 35 years. And this is amazing. And so my book about the power of capitalism, in the German title is, if I would translate it, Why Capitalism is Not the Problem, but the Solution.
Okay, thank you very much, reminding us the global context. So Denise, everything's absolutely perfect.
Well, it's not absolutely perfect, but I think my colleague here has done a fantastic job at giving us a historical context of the success of capitalism. What I think, or where I think I could add value, is to remind us of the slew of economic and political challenges that we face in the next decade and onward, and what I would term as the 6 headwinds, and why I believe that capitalism and the innovation and the notions of creative destruction are absolutely essential to address some of these key issues. It's important, again, to also put into context the fact that 90% of the world's population, 90% lives in the emerging markets. And so you're absolutely right that there tends to be this focus on the challenges that are currently being experienced in developed countries, but that is a microcosm of the broader point that if we are to create long-term sustainable economic growth, we know what to do, which is essentially to drive this idea of capitalism in a way that I believe can be done, not just across the developed world, but and not just across Asia or South America, but in other very impoverished places such as Africa, which according to United Nations estimates will by 2070 represent over 40% of the world's population. But let me just take a moment to highlight for you the challenges that the world will be facing in the next decades and how I think it is that capitalism will be a driver for innovation and R&D that will help solve this. In no particular order, I would argue that there are 6 key challenges. One, firstly, is technology, the risk of the jobless underclass, but attached to that, these real concerns around issues such as quantum computing, competition with China, issues around what is now being termed the splinternet, the risk that we may actually end up with competing technological platforms between a US or a Western-led system and a Chinese system. The implications for that are far-reaching, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second issue is demographic shifts. If you ask demographers, we are now living in a world that is seeing a pace of increase in the world's population that we have never seen in history or prehistory. And according to demographers, we will never see again once the world's population plateaus out at 2100 at around 11 billion people. This is putting us in a particularly unique time where the requirements for us to deliver not just improvements in living standards, but significant improvements in human progress and opportunity becomes even more critical. The third issue is income inequality. Martin highlighted this in his introductory remarks. When I was doing my doctorate at Oxford many years ago, nobody talked about income inequality. Today, income inequality is not just an economic challenge. It is absolutely a challenge, I would argue, in terms of public policy, and specifically it's used as a political weapon. I would go out on a limb and say we do not know how to solve income inequality. We've tried tax and redistribution, left-leaning types of proposals. Those have not worked to stem income inequality. When I'm talking about within income inequality, within country income inequality here. But we've also tried supply-side options, keeping taxes low. That, unfortunately, has also not stemmed the tide of a widening income inequality. We know what to do, I believe, in some respects in this area. One of the key and obvious issues is around the decline in social mobility. And we can, again, talk about where I think capitalism offers an opportunity to reform and to redress this issue around income inequality. Very quickly, a few other ones.
Really quickly. You really must stop.
Natural resource scarcity and energy. I mean, we're trying to solve capitalism here, Martin. This is a big deal. Natural resources and energy. It's infuriating to me as someone who was born and raised in Africa. There are 1.2 billion people on the planet today who have no access to reliable, cost-effective energy. We should be using every ounce of energy that we have to try and redress this, and capitalism offers that opportunity. I will leave the other two, which are essentially the size of debt and what that means for the drag of growth and issues around productivity, to later. But suffice it to say that we are not going to be able to address these issues without there being innovation and creative destruction. And the only system that has promised that, and of course needs to be regulated in some respects and has been shown some shortfalls, is the capitalist system. And I think it's a great shame that we're even having this discussion.
So Anatole, everything's either perfect or it's anyway the only solution. Any different view?
Yes, I'm very glad you've left me to last, because Reiner's set out very well why people believe in capitalism. Dambisa's explained why actually there is a crisis of confidence. And in fact, let me correct you, this audience is actually surprisingly large.
Okay.
Because I've been here all day, and there are more people here than there were in the last session when they were talking about the next American presidential election. So I think there is a crisis of confidence in capitalism, and I think rightly so, although I agree with Reiner that capitalism is the only successful system for organizing society and the economy that has ever been devised, and is actually an enduring and, I would say, essentially indestructible system. It is also a system that is prone to regular, infrequent, but generational crises. So 9 years ago, 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Capitalism 4.0, which tried to explain what had happened in the 2008 and 9 crisis by taking actually the sort of historical perspective that Reiner suggested, but coming to a rather different conclusion. Capitalism is a system that really has been running successfully, at least in Europe and America, for about 200, 250 years. Since 1776, I think one can almost date the start of it. That's a date on which two things occurred. The American Declaration of Independence, creating the first self-consciously democratic capitalist economy in the world, and the publication of The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, creating the theory behind that. Now, in my view, the reason I called it Capitalism 4.0, I think this system, which is essentially successful, but is also an evolutionary system which goes through phases, so that while the most fundamental aspects of capitalism, which I believe to be the sanctity of private property and the organization of society through economic incentives rather than violent coercion, those things are fixed points. But actually, the particular form they take changes dramatically. So that, and in my view, there have been essentially 4 phases of capitalism punctuated by very, very severe crises. In the mid-19th century, you had 1848, the so-called Year of Revolutions all over Europe, which inspired Marx and Engels to write the Communist Manifesto, which incidentally is worth reading for anybody who is a capitalist, because it could have been written yesterday about the perils of globalization and the decline of national cultures and the inherent contradictions of capitalism. Then you had the period between the Russian Revolution and the Great Depression, 1917 to 1939, and then you had the inflation crisis of 1968 to 1982. Now, what emerged from each of those phases was capitalism, but almost unrecognizably different. So that the capitalism of the 1950s and 1960s was almost unrecognizably different from the capitalism of the pre-First World War period, the complete laissez-faire. I would argue that the capitalism that emerged from the Reagan-Thatcher revolution in 1980 to 82 was almost unrecognizably different from the mixed economy, Keynesian, government knows best capitalism of the 1950s and 1960s. But they were all different models of capitalism. In my view, what we are seeing now is a transition from that market fundamentalist Reagan-Thatcher period, which began in the 1980s, to a new, I would argue, the 4th model of capitalism. Now, what exactly it's going to be, it's very, very hard to define, because each of those previous transitions took about 10 years. What I said in my book 10 years ago was that the world economy would actually recover fairly quickly from what seemed like, to many people, like a fatal systemic crisis. But the period of reconstruction, which would design a new politico-economic system, would take much longer, just as it did in the 1970s and 80s, in the 1930s, and in the middle of the 19th century. And I think that's what we're in at the moment. The key issue, and this is where I'll end, and we come back to that, in each of these phases of capitalism has been the relationship between the market and the government sphere, between the private sector and the public sector, between decision-making on the basis of one man, one vote, or one, and usually was men rather than persons for much of the history of capitalism, the difference between decision-making in the political sphere between one man, one vote, or one gun, one vote, and the economic sphere where the decision-making is based on $1, one vote. Now, in all successful societies, most decisions have to be taken on the basis of $1, one vote. But there is a very, very important sphere in which those purely economic and financial incentives are never going to be sufficient. And what I think we've seen in the evolution of each of these phases of capitalism is a different relationship. In the 19th century, government and the economy were almost completely separate. The government's only role in the economy was basically raising taxes for wars and protecting certain vested interests. In the Keynesian period, there was a period when it appeared that the markets were failing and the government knew what to do. In the Thatcherite period, it was the opposite. The governments were failing and the markets knew what to do. I think what we discovered in 2008 is that the government and the markets can both be catastrophically wrong. So we don't trust one or other of them. And finding a new balance is, I think, what the new politics is all about.
Okay, that's very, very helpful. There are an infinitely large number of ways one can structure this discussion now. But what I would like to do in the next 10 minutes or so the response had to be very brief, is to look at the challenges, some of the challenges that have come up without, but you can go to some degree wherever you want. I'd like to start with the situation of the high-income countries, where I think it's right, the the malaise is most obvious politically and socially in the way I think Anatol's framing is very useful. And if I may start with you, Rainer, you brought out very, very correctly something I've written books about myself and so forth. Obviously, the development advances in China, elsewhere, also in the emerging world, have been remarkable. So let's go back to home, as it were. We do see some rather remarkable things. We have the Business Roundtable here in the United States saying they shouldn't pursue shareholder value maximization anymore. There's rising concern about, whether we like it or not, about inequality. It appears a real income stagnation. Is this, in your view, Rainer, anything to do with capitalism? And even if it isn't, are there reforms that we need to think about to make the capitalist system work better, to make people happier with the outcomes in the high-income countries, or is everything actually fine there too?
Absolutely, we need reforms, but with more market, with more capitalism. I think this is a point where, there's one point where I agree with you, that every system is a mixture between state and market. There is no purely capitalist system nowhere in the world. And even there was no purely socialist system nowhere in the world. Even in North Korea, they have a little bit like a private sector. But the question is the mixture. And what is important for me, if I look now, you say, let's look now in the developed countries at home. At home means for me, Germany. And what I see in Germany, we had pro-market reforms by this social democrat Gerhard Schröder 20 years ago. And these were the reason why we are now in a very good situation in Germany, because what he did, more market, less state. He reduced taxes, labor market reforms, and these are the reasons why we are in a very good economic situation. But now in Germany, I see the challenge that we go in the different way. We have, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal some weeks ago. It was the headline, "The dumbest energy policy in the world," and this was about Germany. And this is correct, because what they did, the German government, to restructure the energy sector in a planned economy. And the next thing they will do there, to restructure our German automotive industry, what is the heart of our German industry, in a planned economy. And so I see it as a worldwide attack against capitalism. We have here, if we speak about United States, we have Donald Trump's protectionism that has nothing to do with free market. He did some good things, in my opinion, with tax reform and some deregulation. And we have in China a very complicated situation. I remember when I was last year in China, and I spoke positive in my lectures about Deng Xiaoping, and someone took me to the side and told me, please mention not so often Deng Xiaoping. We don't want to hear his name so often. Yes, and you see what happened there in China today. And then we see a big challenge, what I call a global attack on the rich. What I see here in the United States with Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, what I see in UK with Jeremy Corbyn and with John McDonnell, what I see in Germany as well, where I come from Berlin, we have now a discussion of about expropriation of property owners. We will have a referendum that every property owner who has more than 3,000 units should be expropriated. Yes, and this is the discussion that we have right now in Germany. And so I think we have a worldwide attack against capitalism and against rich people, and rich people are scapegoats for things that most of the people can't understand. And I think one reason was the financial crisis and wrong interpretation
Rainer,
of the financial crisis.
We're running out of time.
Okay, sorry.
You're all so excited about this. Stopping you is very difficult. So, Anatol, really briefly a rejoinder to that.
I mean, I think that there are 4 areas where the model of capitalism that we had from 1980 until 2008 clearly failed and has turned out to be to have an insufficient or inefficient interaction between market and government. They were macroeconomic policy and financial regulation. And that actually has been largely dealt with. We now have a much clearer government and public sector intervention in that. Secondly, the provision of public goods and the dealing with external effects, which, as we know, market systems are not by their competitive market systems, are not by their nature automatically capable of dealing with. And that, I think, touches on a lot of the issues that Dambisa mentioned. Thirdly, the provision of social safety nets. Rightly or wrongly, in my view rightly, perhaps in Rainer's view wrongly, all advanced societies and probably even all poor societies now require social safety nets and expect the society as a whole, whether it's a state or some other non-economic institution, to provide for healthcare, education, and retirement incomes. We didn't get that right. We haven't got the right model of that. And finally, the point that Dambisa mentioned, this is the one that everybody's obsessed with, income distribution. One of the greatest flaws, I think, of the Thatcher-Reagan market fundamentalist, as I call it, model was that it was based on the idea that maximizing economic output was a morally and ethically justifiable objective for society. That only applies if the aggregate output of the economy is then distributed in such a way, according to the principle of Pareto optimality, that nobody is worse off and some people are better off. That's a principle that everybody can accept. Now, economic theory tells you that in principle, if you maximize output, you can then redistribute it in such a way that it is Pareto optimal. But crucially, the market itself does not do the redistribution. And if there isn't some external non-market agency that does that actually forces the redistribution to happen, you can maximize output and maximize GDP, but still leave large sections of society much worse off. And this is what we're discovering. We had a system which was based on the idea that in principle, income could be redistributed, but actually it prohibited the redistribution that was required to equate economic efficiency with ethical and political acceptability.
I'm going to go to you, Dambisa. You might want to comment if you feel very passionate about what you just heard, but I would be particularly interested, given the limited time we have, if you went on to talk more about something we don't discuss so much, which is how an effective capitalist economy can operate not only in the advanced countries where they've been for a long time, or in China and where we're sort of familiar with it, but in the countries with which you're much more familiar than we are in Africa particularly. What are the requirements to make the capitalist revolution, which is indeed 250 years old or so, a truly global one, which includes everybody? Because that seems to us, most people, the biggest of all the challenges.
Yeah. So I think just picking up on something that Anatol said, I don't think you had enough of an opportunity to get to land on the main point, which is that who is the someone who's supposed to be ensuring that the safety net is in place in an effective way, ensuring that we have innovation, et cetera. And to my mind, that is the government. That is the government's role. And so I am not a sort of a heretic who would take the view that we don't need government. We need the government to deliver public goods. We need government to do the things that have been argued for centuries. Unfortunately, the word that I think none of us have mentioned until now is that there's short-termism in the government, and that is a natural artifact of the democratic system. In fact, one of the arguments in the book that is in front of you that I published last year is that we have to figure out a way to match the public imperatives, the political system of democracy with the long-term economic challenges that we face. So all the challenges that I outlined earlier are long-term intergenerational problems, and yet we have a political system in the democratic frame which is very short-term, where we actually reward politicians for very short-term decisions. Jack Ma, I believe it was in Davos a couple of years ago, talked about how trillions of dollars have been spent during the era of globalization regulation by Western countries to fund wars. And yet, the guts of these countries, the middle of America, obviously across the UK, have been neglected. If you look at the American civil engineers reports around infrastructure, we know that these American infrastructure is rated a D+. Look at the OECD report regarding the PISA. This is the education reports on mathematics, reading, and science. How poor the outcomes have become. The healthcare numbers are very well known. I don't need to get into grave detail. But I think Jack Ma's point, which I'm very sympathetic to, is whose fault is that? We cannot then point fingers at the global, globalist system or point fingers at democracy as a broad construct. We have to actually point fingers at the government. I think it's very easy to go after corporations, but corporations are really a collection of people who are looking to the government for some form of regulation. And in a world of short-termism, not just in politics, but also in companies, we're always going to land in a situation that you've just described. I will just want to also clarify that there is, of course, this tendency and maybe an attraction to look back and say, oh, gosh, you've had hundreds of years of successful democracy. The truth of the matter of democracy and capitalism, and I think you were alluding to this again, Anatol, is that by their very nature are evolving. One of the criticisms I hear a lot from in China is people say, well, yeah, it's all very rich Westerners coming to China saying you need more democracy. Why don't you go for green growth and solve your energy problems? Well, Western countries have had hundreds of years of industrial revolution, renaissance, I mean, take your pick, in the last 200 years of a system that was not fair. It did not have universal suffrage. It did not have a system of regulation on the environment. And so I am sympathetic to what emerging markets have to deal with, but we are in a global system, and whether it's disease or environmental concerns, those are borderless challenges. And the more that we can actually drive a capitalist narrative where we do see innovation, we actually see real scientific solutions to address these issues and stop focusing on these sort of political imperatives, I think the closer we are to resolving a lot of the challenges that the world faces today.
Did you want to say anything at all about Africa?
Yeah, look,
very briefly.
So it's really the same answer. I mean, Martin, you know my views. I take issue at this notion that somehow we have one discussion around the rest of the world, and then Africa is sort of separate. The African problem is a problem of leadership. It's a problem of accurate policymaking or good policymaking. I've often been struck by something Mike Bloomberg said when he was a mayor of New York. He said, look, what does the most effective politician look like? You want people who are data-driven, who are forward-leaning, who you focus on measured outcomes and where there's no corruption. If you can get that confluence of four factors, very basic, in place, you're going to get great delivery of outcomes. The problem is that there's corruption, and both in developed and developing countries. We know this, and clearly there are a lot of issues in terms of governments not being forward-leaning and certainly not being data-driven or focused on measured outcomes. So we are basically suffering from the sort of political environment that we deserve, and I think ultimately that's where things would land.
Okay, very brief.
I just want to add. Shall I use this? Or
yeah.
I just wanted to add, one point. I think Dambisa has put her finger on the essential problem that I was talking about, that, we've had 10 years now that we've realized that our democratic system has largely failed, both on the economic side, but also in the political side. And we are too confident that the underlying politics of democracy is a model that is going to work for the world as a whole. It doesn't even work for our societies. So I think what I would answer about Africa, but actually about emerging countries all over the world, it is far from clear that they would or should adopt the model of democracy that we have developed here. And we tend to, the Americans, the British, the Europeans, the IMF, tend to go to these countries and say, well, you need to have an election, and if that election produces the wrong results, let's have another election. Elections are not necessarily the answer to political problems.
Okay, I don't think we can go and we weren't asked to about the crisis of democracy, another very good panel. That I'm writing a book on it, but I'm not going to say anything about it. I've been given a couple of questions, not many actually, but these are very good questions. And I'd like to start with Rainer, because I think it's a good question for you. The question is, and I'll have a little twist on it, is there a way to build on capitalism via business participating more? That's not... And the example given is, as I've already mentioned, the Business Roundtable's recent change, with its emphasis on the purpose of a corporation, focusing on stakeholders as well as shareholder value. The reason I think this is a particularly interesting question for you, from my point of view, is that many of us think that German success, while of course it's widely thought that German success, the success of German corporations, while we, I think, pretty well would all accept the reforms that you mentioned, but going back even further in the past, are linked to the idea that the German corporation is not a shareholder value maximizing corporation, but precisely by structure and intention, a stakeholder focused corporation. That's what makes it so effective. Do you agree with that? And if you don't, do you think that actually the Business Roundtable's shift in what they think of as that direction is a catastrophic mistake?
So I heard about this Business Roundtable, and sometimes I hear even about billionaires who want to get taxed more, who likes to pay more taxes, yes. And I think it's more than it's a media story. It's a minority approach from business people that they want to go this way. It's like I learned it when I was a journalist that if the dog bites the postman, it's no story. But if the postman bites the dog, this is a story. And so if you have the story about corporations who want these things like on this business table, or like billionaires who want to be taxed more, I don't think that this is the solution, and I don't think that it's correct how we interpret the success in Germany after the Second World War. This success by Ludwig Erhard, he was a critic of the welfare state like we have it now. And if you compare it, what's now, I speak about Germany because you mentioned it, because you called for redistribution, but this is what we already have. In Germany, we spent €1 billion for social welfare. It's amazing. 1 billion, not 1 billion, 1 trillion. 1 trillion, yes, I'm in a job. 1 billion, but no, we spent 1 trillion only for social welfare in Germany. And I think even here in the United States, I read this book by Vögele. The title was Never Enough. And this was very interesting for me. Never enough means, for example, if you raise minimum wage, this is one discussion that you have now here in the United States, that it should be, I think, $15 is now what they... And I'm very convinced, if it is $15, it's 1 or 2 years more, and everyone would explain, oh, you can't live with $15, it's not enough, it should be 17 or 18 or 20. It's something like never enough, and this is the problem with redistribution. If you think that you can cool down a little bit this discussion about inequality, if you have more distribution, it will never happen, because if you give more, they will say, for a moment, it's not enough, it has to be more. And so I think this is not a solution for this inequality discussion. And I don't care so much about inequality. I care about the situation of the poor people. And this was the reason why I had this global view, that for the poor people, capitalism is a great story, a great success story. I think I think the strong people, they don't need capitalism because they come around everywhere in the world, even in a dictatorship. They don't need capitalism. Capitalism is a system much needed for poor people. And what I don't understand...
Okay, we've got 3 minutes left. So unless somebody wants to jump into defense of the Business Roundtable, do you want to jump into defense of the Business Roundtable, Anatole?
It'll
be much more fun.
All I can recommend is listen to what Jamie Dimon was talking about at lunchtime. I think he did a very, very good defense of it. No, and you know, he made the point that you can... Sweden, in his view, is a more capitalist economy than the United States. There are many, there's actually more private entrepreneurship in Sweden than there is in the United States, even though the tax rates are much higher. In the United States, you had tax rates up to 91% in the 1950s and 1960s, which was the period of fastest growth in the US economy. So I'm not recommending tax rates of 90%, but the idea that you can't have higher tax rates without destroying the entrepreneurial activity in capitalism, I think is wrong. And I think it's also unrealistic to think that you can improve education, you can improve the life chances of the bottom 10% of the, or even the bottom 40% of the population, as Ray Dalio was talking about, without spending significant amounts of public money.
But if you
wait a sec. Did you want to comment on this?
I was just going to say very quickly, but that goes back to the point about effective government. I mean, I know this, I'm throwing out something that we've been talking about, you know, for as long as humans have been on the earth. But the truth of the matter is that the problem we have is that the governments are ineffective. It boils down to ineffective government. Education, poor statistics in education, bad infrastructure, it is at the feet of government, as far as I'm concerned.
There's also a question about rentier capitalism. So what I ask is, one of you can only answer, do you think that this is a relevant concept? And if so, what is the single most important thing to do about it? Does anybody here want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think technology companies, the largest technology companies, are going through a transition from being innovators, being technological innovators, into being monetizers of monopoly rents. And actually, the response to that, there's a fair, I think economic theory is pretty straightforward. The response to that is breakups, regulation, standard antitrust policies, which I think we are beginning to see all over the world. And this is a good example of how the balance between the public and the private sector is constantly shifting in a successfully evolving capitalist economy.
I've got to close this. I'm sorry, I know it's only just started. I think you've had a pretty vigorous debate between somewhat different views. I wish we'd had somebody who was really on the social democratic or democratic socialist side. It would probably have been a bit more exciting because everybody here really sorts of agrees. But nonetheless, there's been a very, very good exchange. I think everybody agrees that capitalism is a great economic system. And the core questions are its relationship with government, governance, and politics. And that really is a very difficult and inescapable relationship. I would be very, very worried, however, whatever happens in the world as a whole, if we, from countries like my own, came to the conclusion that capitalism is so wonderful that what we really need to do is dispense with democracy so it can become even more wonderful. If that's where we are, I'm on the barricades and they can shoot me. And I'm not joking. I am not joking. There are real choices here, but I think the core of it is absolutely right. How do we revitalize capitalism in a way that is acceptable in all our societies? And that's the great challenge, I think, politically and also technically. And it's going to be quite something. So I think it's the right topic, and I very much enjoyed the discussion, and I thank the panelists for their participation.